Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today centers on a question that comes up very frequently among Muslim consumers all over the world. Is Red Bull energy drink considered halal or, permissible under Islamic dietary law?
I see why that question is asked, but for global trade, the question isn't simply, is it halal in a vacuum? It's more, is this specific product verifiable, compliant, and documented for my destination market? The core issue, really, from a business perspective, is how you translate these complex religious requirements into viable, low-risk international trade documentation that satisfies customs.
And my position is that the assessment of its halal status has to prioritize ingredient purity and clarity for the consumer's conscience. This focus, it's driven by a real apprehension about the origin of ingredients, things like potential animal-derived substances and, of course, the presence of any intoxicating alcohol. Consumers need assurance that the formulation itself aligns with the universal spirit of Islamic dietary standards, regardless of the local regulatory climate.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it a little differently. While ingredient purity is, of course, foundational, the halal status, especially when you're dealing with huge volumes of fast-moving consumer goods, it really ships into a technical regulatory matter. It's driven by very specific certification requirements that vary, sometimes widely, from country to country. And this reliance on localized documentation, well, it impacts the entire supply chain. It dictates logistics, distribution risk, and ultimately, whether you can even clear customs.
So the central question we're exploring today is this. Does the halal status of a globally traded product like Red Bull depend primarily on its ingredient formulation and an ethical commitment to universal standards, or does it depend on localized documented certification procedures driven almost entirely by import risk management?
Okay, so let's start by establishing the primary source of this consumer doubt. For many Muslim consumers, the uncertainty around Red Bull, or really any highly processed energy drink, it kind of boils down to three main concerns: the origin of an ingredient called taurine, the potential for trace alcohol, and the inconsistency of halal certification across different manufacturing sites. For a product to be accepted as halal, it needs assurance of acceptable processing, contamination controls, the absolute absence of intoxicating alcohol, and critically, confirmation of no harm or forbidden animal-derived ingredients.
I come at it from a different way. We have to separate what is, an understandable consumer myth from modern industrial reality. Let's tackle that taurine issue directly, because it's probably the most persistent myth out there. A lot of people assume it's animal-derived because the word taurine comes from the Latin taurus, which means bull. And that association immediately raises a red flag about haram sourcing.
And that historical association is powerful. It persists because, historically, taurine actually was extracted from animal sources. So for consumers who are looking for religious reassurance, it takes a pretty significant effort to reconcile that history with modern industrial practices.
Right. But the reality today is far simpler and, importantly, it's highly documented. The source material confirms that the taurine used in modern high-volume food production, including in Red Bull, is produced by chemical synthesis. It's manufactured in controlled industrial facilities. It involves zero animal extraction, which makes it chemically derived and, inherently permissible from a raw ingredient standpoint.
The fact that it's synthetic is crucial, I agree, but I'm not convinced that synthetic sourcing is sufficient assurance for all global fatwa bodies. If we look at the principle of istihala, that's the theological principle of material transformation, some more conservative interpretations might still require a closer look at the original chemical precursors, especially if the synthesizing agents themselves have questionable origins. Does the modern certification process really account for all these theological differences?
That is an excellent point. And that is exactly where the technical framework of trade compliance has to override that localized theological complexity. Certifying bodies like JACM in Malaysia or MUI in Indonesia, they don't just ask, is it synthetic? They require documented proof of the entire chemical pathway, making sure the input materials are pure and the process itself is free from contamination. The goal isn't theological consensus. The goal is documented, auditable compliance. If the product gets certification from a recognized authority, that process is deemed rigorous enough to establish permissibility.
Red Bull is marketed as non-alcoholic, and we know no alcohol is intentionally added as an intoxicating ingredient. However, the complexity comes in because many flavor extracts use alcohol as a carrier, or trace amounts can result naturally from fermentation in the processing of other ingredients.
And discussions about trace alcohol are pervasive across processed foods, not just energy drinks. I mean, fruit juices, certain types of bread, natural flavorings, they can all register trace parts per million of ethanol. The source material is clear. Red Bull's stimulating effect comes from caffeine and sugar, not from intoxicating alcohol. The challenge really is in defining the boundary of non-intoxicating.
Precisely. We lack a single, universally accepted global standard for what constitutes a permissible trace amount. Some halal bodies will adhere to a zero detection rule, period. Others will accept a threshold, maybe 0.1% or even 0.5% ethanol, arguing that amounts below this level are non-intoxicating and therefore acceptable.
Well, from a trade perspective, you need quantifiable standards. This lack of uniformity is an operational nightmare for a global brand. When a container lands in a specific market, the importer has to know which regulatory threshold applies there. So the safest approach for B2B sales is just to verify the product against the local regulation. If the destination market, let's say a specific GCC country, mandates zero detection, the importer must have documentation confirming that their specific batch meets that standard, no matter what's permissible somewhere else.
And this is where that fragmentation of certification creates these huge trade barriers and, frankly, consumer distrust. The complexity of market-by-market verification puts a huge burden on the end consumer and also on the small-scale importer. When you're sourcing Red Bull wholesale, especially from major production hubs in, say, Vietnam or Thailand, the cans often lack the recognizable halal logo that's required by markets in Malaysia or Indonesia.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the economic necessity that drives local labeling? I mean, the labeling decisions in Vietnam are driven by local Vietnamese consumer demand. If the domestic market doesn't require a halal logo, the manufacturer may not include it on the can, even if that plant's output is certified for export. The absence of a logo reflects local market demand, not necessarily the export integrity of the product itself.
Yet for the consumer or the smaller distributor in a halal-sensitive market, that logo is the primary point of assurance. It's everything. The absence of a logo, regardless of the product's inherent purity or the existence of a certificate thousands of miles away, is a critical friction point. It's a barrier to consumer adoption. It forces people to rely on, potentially outdated third-party lists or unverified internet sources.
But reliance on a visual logo it's insufficient for managing regulatory and financial risk when you're shipping thousands of cases of product. The only way to mitigate the risk of seizure at customs or a mass recall at the retail level is through proactive, document-based verification. This means moving beyond the visual label to batch-level, plant-specific documentation. And this is where the technical, regulatory focus, my position, provides genuine certainty. Let's shift our focus entirely to the B2B necessity, moving from consumer concern to commercial certainty. Red Bull is a high-rotation FMCG SKU globally. It's particularly sought after in emerging markets. Importers and wholesalers, they require absolute, quantifiable certainty to protect their investment, especially when they're dealing with markets that mandate religious compliance, where the penalties for non-compliance can be severe.
So if we accept that documentation is the absolute foundation of trade, what specifically does that formal checklist look like? And how does it translate this sort of theoretical concept of halal into practical, verifiable data points for an importer?
The checklist is really designed to eliminate ambiguity. First, the buyer has to verify the product SKU and flavor. This is critical because a manufacturer might use one flavor extract for the classic Red Bull that is compliant, but a different flavor variant, say a fruit flavor, might use a different coloring or extract that may not be. Halal approval is often flavor-specific.
And you mentioned location specificity earlier.
Exactly. Second, they have to confirm the country and plant of manufacture. Certification is almost always plant-specific. The same brand produced in plant A in Europe might use different sourcing or processing lines than plant B in Asia, which means their respective halal certificates are non-transferable. Third, the ingredient specification sheet is mandatory to confirm the specific breakdown and certify no haram inputs. Fourth, the halal certificate itself needs to be scrutinized. Check the issuing body, the unique certificate number, the validity dates. Make sure it's current and recognized.
The scope is also vital, I imagine, to prevent misrepresentation.
Absolutely. You have to look at the certification scope to ensure the document covers the exact SKUs being shipped and the specified manufacturing site. Sophisticated buyers then must request production lot or batch information to directly link that documentation to the physical goods in the container. And finally, importers must confirm the certificate is recognized by the local halal authority listing in the destination country, so the specific requirements of JACIM or MUI to ensure smooth entry and acceptance. The sheer complexity of this verification process, it just underscores why a generalized global assurance is impossible. We're asking global brands to maintain 20 different sets of compliance books just to ship the same can of soda. It's an operational nightmare.
I acknowledge the comprehensive commercial utility of this checklist for managing risk. That level of detailed documentation is clearly necessary for efficient global trade. However, my concern remains that this reliance on complex paper trails shifts the burden and potentially elevates the cost, making it harder for small businesses to source directly and increasing the reliance on costly specialized expertise. This complexity in itself is sort of a failure of global governance to simplify the standard. Furthermore, and this is a vital point for the end consumer, even when a product is confirmed and certified halal through all this rigorous documentation, it does not mean it is healthy.
That's a necessary distinction we have to maintain. Halal status speaks entirely to permissibility under dietary law, not nutritional quality.
Exactly. While the drink is compliant, a standard can of Red Bull contains a significant amount of caffeine and added sugar. Moderation is still strongly recommended for consumers. It is so important to separate religious compliance, which the commercial checklist confirms, from nutritional advice, which suggests caution. And that distinction has to be clear regardless of any compliance documentation.
So in summary, for the B2B sector, the question is, Red Bull energy drink halal yields a very practical answer. Yes, it can be. But only when it's verified for the destination market using document-based assurance that aligns with local regulatory bodies. This requirement for deep documentation and market-specific compliance is where specialist wholesale partners become essential, because they mitigate the financial and regulatory risk.
And from the consumer and religious compliance perspective, permissibility ultimately depends on the ingredient statement, the absence of intoxicating alcohol by formulation and testing, and crucially, the guidance provided by the local halal authority that governs their market. We have to continue to push global brands for standardized transparency while recognizing that halal status must be verified per country, not just assumed globally based on a brand name.
To professional buyers who are sourcing Red Bull in bulk for these halal-sensitive markets, navigating all these plant-specific certificates and localized demands, it really requires an established supply chain partner. Asia Grocery Wholesale, or AGW, is a trusted export partner that manages the complexity of wholesale FMCG exports from Vietnam. They specialize in mixed SKU container loading and, critically, offering export documentation support that is specifically aligned with the required halal authorities of the destination country.
We have explored how the tension between universal ingredient purity and localized regulatory compliance really shapes this debate over halal status for a globally traded product. There is clearly more to explore in the material when considering this tension between consumer confidence and documented compliance.
And for wholesale inquiries and to confirm available SKUs and certification status for your market, you can contact Asia Grocery Co. Ltd. AGW via contact@egrocery.asia or visit egrocery.asia.